it was more of a requirement to be self-reliant. You just had to, or else you didn't make it. And so that self-reliant and independence and, I'm going to take care of myself and I don't need you attitude is, I think, in our DNA. And that was part of what, motivated the founders to say, hey, we can take care of ourselves. We don't need your onerous decision-making back there for our daily lives here. We're better off without you.
This episode of the Free Cities podcast is brought to you by Veritas Village. Now, Veritas Village is an off-grid, self-sufficient place for people who are interested in living a normal, freedom-oriented life. You can reduce your reliance on corporations or government systems in your very own energy self-sufficient luxury home with its own water supply, located in a perfect climate to grow your own food. Communities use Bitcoin, and you can also buy your property with Bitcoin as well. www.ecovillages.life/podcast for more info. Please don't forget to mention the Free Cities podcast, and in the meantime, enjoy the conversation. I came into this movement through the Bitcoin movement. I'm a Bitcoiner, and the Free Cities movement is a good fit with the Bitcoin movement. It's a kind of Bitcoin's freedom in the digital world. Free cities are freedom in the real world. And I must admit, when I first heard the idea, I thought, yeah, cool, whatever, but didn't think much of it. But that was because I'd never actually thought about governance before. I'd never questioned it. And that was the most interesting thing for me. I spent the first year deconstructing many of my preconceptions and many of the things that I just took for granted. Like, the state is what it is. It does what it does. It takes money from you at gunpoint. It uses a monetary policy that inflates away your savings. All these things were things that I just accepted. And I got to my late 40s before I started addressing them, which is, when you think about it, it's pretty astonishing.
Was that sort of a sudden thing that happened, or did you associate with somebody who said, slapped you around and said, Tim,
I've always been what I would call, I suppose the nearest thing would be libertarian, I would say. That's been my attitude always, but I've worked in the media for years. So I wasn't exposed, we didn't. The right was the boogeyman, and the left was right, which is what you, as in correct. And you don't really think about that. You just know the memes.
Accept it.
You just accept it, right? And what happened for me was, because I was a Bitcoiner and I'd thought a lot about Bitcoin and money and various things like that, and there's a big crossover with the libertarian community there when you track it back to the start. When we had the opportunity to vote on leaving the European Union, I saw it as a great chance to decentralize power. Yeah. And lo and behold, when I admitted that openly on Facebook to my friends, I couldn't believe the response I got. And I had a moment where I suddenly thought, oh my God, these people don't think like me, actually. How can you not want to decentralize power away from this big unelected thing? And after a few months after Brexit, Trump's first term started, and I watched the whole election through the eyes of a Trump supporter for the first time, because I'd seen what happened with Brexit. I was the Brexiteer, mm-hmm. who I supposedly was racist, right. All the usual stuff. So when I started watching,
was there? I keep interrupting you.
Go for it.
But was there a natural sort of connection to you to say, okay, this makes sense to me. Brexit is a good idea. We should have, get away from the centralized European Union and to the whole Trump phenomena for you.
Well, no, the connection was that Trump supporters were being labeled as racists and bigots and all this kind of stuff. And I was thinking, I've just had a version of that. So I'm just going to go ahead and sort of hypothesize that they're not. So I started watching social media and looking at the side of social media that I hadn't probably ever seen before. And I was one of the people that thought he's going to win. I don't think you realise what's going on here. I think he's going to win. And people were laughing, and lo and behold, he did. And beyond that, I've been on a very slow deconstruction of a number of concepts, democracy being one of them, whether or not democracy is a good idea or a bad idea. It was an untouchable thing for my whole life. Do this for democracy, we've got to fight for democracy. We've got to, and I just thought, yeah, sure, we do. Democracy is amazing. It's fair. Everyone gets to vote.
Right.
But really, it was my connection with the Free Cities Foundation that really hammered home the fact that you don't need a democratic system to run a really good ship, let's say, and literally a ship.
Right.
But I mean, to run a good country,
right.
You don't need to have to vote on everything. It's actually quite a backward way of looking at it.
Not only do you not need to, but you shouldn't be able to vote on everything,
right?
As it affects other people's lives, right? You shouldn't be able to.
Sure, but so how did this become so prevalent then? This idea,
the whole idea of democracy.
Yeah.
Well, that's a long story, right? You go back to Athens. And in my view, I mean, it's great that you've come to that conclusion. Democracy is not a good thing. I mean, democratic institutions as a part of governance, or either in a family situation to some degree, or a corporate situation, or certainly a nation state. There's institutions where you go, okay, we're going to vote on these things, but that isn't the purpose of government, and certainly democracy is a bad thing. And as I say, it goes back to Athens, where they democratically elected to vote and convict Socrates, right? What a horrible thing. One of the great tragedies of history and philosophy, right?
Okay, well, there must be something good about it then. Because it is an idea. It's an idea that has lasted. I think it's undeniable that the concept, at least, of democracy has stood the test of time. So there must be something in it.
Well, there is something in it too, and I think you put your finger on it. That people have an emotional attachment to fairness, and that's the appeal. It's like, well, in fact, that's part of why the American founding was so exceptional and has been abused in the sense of people attaching that language of equal rights. The whole equality. We're all equal before the law, which is true, but we're not equal in any other sense. I mean, no one is equal with another person, and shouldn't be necessarily. I mean, the great part of life is having values to share with each other, differences. Asymmetry of values in many ways. Democracy has its appeal because I think emotional appeal because people think, well, it's more fair and it appeals to that equality idea. And it's certainly not, at least on the surface, authoritarian. And you don't have a king. You don't have one king who's just telling you what to do.
So you're not a monarchist either, then?
I'm not a monarchist at all. No, I'm not a monarchist. I'm not for democracy. I am for a republic. I think a republican form of government is the correct one, but it's got to be ruled by a constitution, and the constitution can only work if the people are truly citizens. Enough people are truly citizens and care enough about their freedom. You have to have a culture of people who do value, love, cherish their lives, and therefore require freedom to pursue their lives. So
would you say then, because I've got an opinion on this for sure, would you say America has a culture of freedom?
No.
Really?
Not anymore. Now we have a remnant of a culture of freedom, and we have we're still a young country in one sense. So it's the rest of the world and the rest of history are weighing on us. This is my view. But we still do have, most Americans today, they kind of fall for the monarchy in England and, go along with Princess Di and so forth. That's that sort of romanticism about kings and queens and, in a sense, medievalism, in my view. But they don't take it seriously. There are more and more they do. I think that's part of the Trump phenomenon myself. More and more you have personality, cultish worship. He's going to be the one who saves us, rather than saying, no, you're in charge of your own life. Save yourself.
So that's interesting because as a Brit, as a limey, I would say America at its soul is a country of freedom. I mean, it's based on principles of freedom.
It is based on principles.
But you
Absolutely.
That's not the world you live in now.
Well, the culture itself, when you talk about culture, I mean, we have, again, I use that term remnant, or, there's this legacy, and it's kind of like you were saying before, you just kind of grow up in a certain way. If you grow up in a world of media and journalism that's just sort of accepting the leftism as, or the central planning, or, the government's role in our lives, you don't examine it. And I think most people are not examining. And I think that's what it takes. I mean, that's what I mean by an engaged citizen. I mean, our founders had this idea of people reinvigorating all the time the whole concept of freedom. And it really does. Reagan talked about, it takes each generation to rediscover freedom. And that's what's necessary. And it's hard. It's hard.
It must. Well, just thinking about it, it appears I have little or no connection then to the founding fathers and their principles at all. And you sound to me like you kind of do. So kind of explain. Can you explain it to me then?
Well, I would say I revere them. I'm a student of the American founding, and I think they really did do something truly exceptional. I do believe in the idea of American exceptionalism. And sometimes that even is characterized. Oh, you're racist for even believing that. But they did a lot of work, and I think it's possible that phenomenon that happened could only have happened in a quote the New World. It couldn't have happened in Europe. People were much more. It was more of a requirement to be self-reliant. You just had to, or else you didn't make it. And so that self-reliant and independence and, I'm going to take care of myself and I don't need you attitude is, I think, in our DNA. And that was part of what, motivated the founders to say, hey, we can take care of ourselves. We don't need your onerous decision-making back there for our daily lives here. We're better off without you.
But you've just alluded to an interesting predicament then, because there is no new world now, really. Really?
There is all over. I mean, you could talk about Elon Musk's Mars colonization, or certainly your free city movement. I mean, in a sense, that is a new world. I mean, the new world, in one sense, I said it, and I did mean it. Physically, there's a whole new continent that really doesn't have this kind of idea of governance this way and individualism. But I think there are lots of new worlds. There's lots of new frontiers that can be settled in that way or explored in that way to say, no, there's freedom that we can.
Well, that's interesting because we talk a lot on this podcast about frontiers. And I suppose I've settled on the fact that frontiers are the places where all the good stuff happens, right? And that there are little or no physical frontiers left. We could say the sea, we could say space, but on land it's very difficult. So what about in America? I take it you perceive a sort of a mental frontier as being the place Absolutely. Where all this kind of stuff happens.
And that's the most important frontier. I mean, in one sense. I mean, I think it is important to recognize that historically that's what happened, but that's not necessary, especially when we have the ideas right now that we do. I think you could reorganize the most North Korea in lots of ways, but that means there has to be the intellectual work done for a cultural change. And North Korea is, it's hard to imagine, but I can imagine that. I mean, I can imagine any place on Earth right now that is the most oppressive place you can imagine, that being changed. But that means you have to change hearts and minds. A critical mass of people who say, no, this is not the right way to do it, and it's a moral issue. And they make it a moral issue, and then it will change over time.
I think it's a bit unfair to compare North Korea to the US. And
I didn't mean to do that.
I mean in the sense that I think North Korea could collapse. The ideology could collapse quite easily.
Absolutely.
But I think in America it's much more subtle. It's not 1984. It's more Brave New World. Do you know what I mean?
I think so, but I also think that's where there's the most potential is still here in the U.S. because you do have that remnant. You do have people who are still willing to say, no, I don't want to take it. But they have to recognize, even when they say that, I want to be free, I'm a free person, what that means. I mean, there's all these people in America who, there's preppers and there's militia people who are like, we're going to say screw the government and be free, and they don't have any clue as to what that means. To compare, and I don't want to characterize all of them that way, because there are probably some who do, but they're not having much influence, at least that I can tell. But that kind of mentality, I don't think understands what the founders did in terms of saying, no, we are going to war. I mean, you saw sort of a little dribble of it at that January 6th, protest. There were some people who were like, we're taking back our government. They had no plan. And the worst part is they had no intellectual, moral foundation, which is what the founders actually had. They had spent decades reading, thinking, reacting to the British laws and understanding history and understanding governance and human nature for centuries. So they actually had done the work. They had tilled the ground to actually have that kind of revolution. There's a fantastic book I would recommend. I can't remember the title of it. The author's Brad Thompson, and he basically is. It's the American mind, the American revolutionary mind, and he basically is going back and saying it wasn't in 1776. He was basically answering John Adams' question about the revolution, not just the war, but the revolution that happened in the hearts and minds of people 10, 15 years, 20 years before that gradually erupted into, no, this is what we have to do.
Can you set the scene then for me as a Brit who knows little or nothing about that time? What was that period, that 15 years? What was it that was happening that was stirring all this up inside these young men?
They were reading a lot. They were reading and talking to each other at the same time they were having to produce. I mean, in one sense, America lacks a philosophical basis. I mean, these were doers. Now, is that right to call, to say Jefferson wasn't philosophical? I mean, that's heresy. But in one sense, the American founders were thinkers and doers, and so they were busy. Now, again, some people could say, they were busy, colonizing or whatever. But they were busy doing things. They were busy, making their way in the wilderness and having to grow their own food and having to set up trading, having to set up a government structure, and then having to deal with we are subjects of the king. So they were doing lots of reading, thinking, doing the hard work of thinking through these real human nature issues and moral issues on what it is to be a human being and what it means to thrive.
And you believe, as you were saying that, I can think of a number of similar attributes of modern society, not just America, but let's use America as an example, but coming to the realization that you're being stolen from on a daily basis through inflation. Is that the kind of thing you're talking about?
Absolutely. And there's more and more people who are aware of that. Now, this is, my my organization, the Defenders of Capitalism Project, is about waking people up to those facts. But what's amazing to observe is capitalism has made people rich, lazy, and not necessarily motivated to think. So, and I don't blame capitalism necessarily for that, but we have such abundance, and so even though you're being stolen from left and right, it's testament to the fact that you're so much wealthier than anyone else who's ever lived, right? I mean, even the middle class or poorest people in America live better than most kings of all time. And so that has lessened the motivation for someone to strive and to look for that frontier that you talk about.
That's an important point, I think, the abundance we see now, because I think, and this goes back to what I was saying about 1984 versus it's not an authoritarian government necessarily controlling you. It's a life of abundance and ease and dopamine, and that's keeping you subdued. Would you agree with that? I think America, when people like myself come from outside, we see so much abundance and also an abundance mindset. because abundance is one thing. Like there's abundance where I live. It's just people don't necessarily pick the large portion when it's offered to them. But in America, it's large is the small. So it's hard baked into the
and
mindset.
that's good and bad too. Right?
Sure,
I mean, that whole idea of abundance mindset is, I think, important to cultivate in people. And in my girls, my children, I think it's important to have people understand that that's the way the world can be. But also the whole idea of consumption for consumption's sake. Not even thinking about your values. What are your tastes? Why do you like that? Why are you consuming that right now? Is it and you mentioned dopamine and so forth. There's all kinds of things in human anatomy and psychology that makes us consumers and addictors in a sense, right? Where we become and again, I use the term sometimes lazy about our own habits and consumption.
Going back to the founding fathers again, do you think we need a struggle in order to really understand this stuff? Or let's say not necessarily you and I, but people in general. Do you think there needs to be?
I mean, there absolutely needs to be a struggle. Does it need to be? If you're asking me, does there need to be a revolution in terms of violence and things like that? I don't know if that's what you're asking. I don't.
No, I mean, when you were talking about the founding fathers, you painted a picture of struggle, and then a realization that there was something causing this struggle that needed to be rectified.
Yeah,
that's so
absolutely.
Yeah,
it's work. It's intellectual and moral self-examination and work to say, what are the ideas? What are the values that I have? What's gonna actually further my life? And what kind of system do I want to live under that's going to encourage that kind of thriving? And that's work to digest, to think about, to say, well, how am I going to respond to other people? How am I going to respond to the existing hierarchy and structure that I live in today? It's work to be able to challenge that.
Do you see that around you?
I see it all around me personally, but partly as I surround myself with people who are like that. I mean, this whole organization, the leadership program, the Rockies, that's what we foster, is people who want to do that work. Now, some are further along that path than others, but that's the kind of personality that I try to surround myself with, is people who want to be challenged and to think through what's important in their life and how they're going to get it.
And how do these ideas fit in with the current system? Is this would you imagine that this system needs to fail and for a new one to arise, or are you someone who believes that you might be able to change it from the inside?
That's a good question. I thought you might ask me something like that.
Well, I just thought of it then as you were talking. I want to know, because I'm on this journey too.
It depends on what you mean by the system. If you're talking about the constitutional order that we have and the bureaucratic state, the welfare regulatory state that it's evolved into, is that what you mean by the system?
I mean that I know what you want. How are you going to get it, if you see what I mean? Do you
know what I want?
Well, according to what I've just concluded from what we've just spoken about, it doesn't seem to be that you would want people to vote for you to give it to them. Right. Okay. So we know that. So how does this happen? That's what I want to know.
Well, voting is part of it. I guess the way you kind of pose the question is, can it happen within the system? I think is the way I interpret it. I mean, can this system evolve? And I definitely think it can, but we're at a point potentially of no return where it can't evolve. I mean, again, I keep going back to this constitutional system that was set up. Our rule of law allows for the people to claim back their freedom anytime they want it. Now, again, I mentioned, we have all kinds of debt, and we have this, I characterize as, the welfare regulatory state that we have that should be, 95% of it should go away. And I don't have a lot of confidence that Doge and Trump are going to do it. I'm hopeful that they can do a lot, but the American people can, within the structure that's there, reclaim their freedom. Will they is a big question, and is it too late? is another question.
So more in a decentralized way, on a day-to-day basis, reclaiming those aspects of your life which you are enshrined in a constitution.
Yeah. Well, and there's so many things that don't have to do with governance per se. As we were talking about before, politics per se. I mean, there's so many things that a person can do to reclaim their freedom and how they respond to it. Now, they have to accept consequences. I mean, there is a reality of, it's not metaphysical reality that I have all these regulators of my financial business, right? I mean, that doesn't have to be that way, but it is a reality right now. It exists. And I have to either say, I'm going to comply with these laws and regulations, even though, a great many of them are bullshit. Now, some of them are rational and I would do anyway, but I either have to decide, am I going to comply with this or not? Or am I going to make a free choice and do something different? And then I have to accept the consequences. And there's millions of ways that people can do that in their lives all the time, where it has nothing to do with, well, I didn't win the election. My guy lost, so now I just have to live with it. I mean, one of the things that I think is so important for people to recognize is that voting is the lowest bar for citizenship. And part of the problem, and this is true, I think, of both Democrats, big D, Democratic Party in our country, but also Republicans. The whole political culture in our country is the deification of the vote. We all, that's this idea of, worshiping democracy. And that's, that is just silly because most of our lives, I mean, okay, in the U.S., we have a national sort of election every 2 years, but what are you doing with most of your life between those 2 years? You're voting with your dollars, you're voting with your feet, you're voting with where you want to live, who you're going to associate with. You're voting all the time in that sense, your actions. And you can reclaim freedom in every one of those segments of your life without worrying about someone in government telling you what you can do.
You'll probably laugh, but it was only relatively recently in my life that I realized that voting was literally me signing a piece of paper to say, you can now tell me what to do, which is bizarre because I've always hated being told what to do. And, but it's something, and I don't know, I've got an open mind. I have done my whole life. It's quite astonishing really how you can spend so much of your time not thinking through certain things. And this for me is the big one but it was always quite central in my life, the idea of freedom. Even as a kid, being told what to do, hate it. I hate it now. I still hate it, and I do struggle with those silly regulations. And I don't actually know how to deal with it, in all honesty, because when I look at the many and myriad of things which bug me in my life, I also know that, right, if I was to stand up to that, then I've got a lot of bullshit in mind, more probably than that regulation. Yeah. And I don't like that choice. I don't like making that choice. It feels like it's minimizing me somehow.
Yeah, it is.
So how would you deal with it then? I mean, it's not a specific. I could give you a specific example.
I'd be interested in terms of I could give you some of mine in the financial.
Well, one's just happened to me. Okay. So there is a new strain of bird flu in the UK. Okay. And an edict was sent out from central governing bodies that now chickens all have to be kept indoors. Now, bearing in mind, I live on a farm in the middle of nowhere with a very small number of chickens, and I did some research. I looked into bird flu. I worked out what the risks were. My conclusion was it's no risk to humans. It might be a risk to the bird. But I know my birds, they would rather be living outside and potentially getting flu than being shut in a cage. I also realised that basically bird flu was happening in factory farms and it wasn't happening on small little farms out in the middle of nowhere. Anyway, I spend all weekend building a bloody cage for these things, a big outdoor cage, because I thought that there was a possibility that it might come back to, as we say, bite me in the arse.
You mean from a legal standpoint?
Yes.
You're not complying?
Yes.
So what do they say in terms of inside? What counts as it?
Well, you need to isolate your birds from other birds. I mean, bird flu, believe it or not, is transmitted by birds, which fly everywhere. I don't know whether you noticed that, but they're flying all over the place. So it's a bit like masks and COVID. People thought you wore a mask to protect other people. So the same goes with chickens. You keep them in a cage to protect. You don't. You keep them in a cage to protect themselves. If you don't want them to get bird flu, it's nothing else, you know. So really, you're not doing a service to the community. You're just doing a service to the bird. And I know those birds. You know, they're chickens. I'm happy for them to take that risk, the 0.001% chance of getting bird flu and dying from it. I'm sure that was what they want, because as soon as I put them in the cage, they were strutting up and down. You could tell they didn't want to be in there, you know. So things like that bug me. My option is to defy it, but then have someone walking, you know, or a neighbour. We've got the odd nosy neighbour. Not many of them, because we live very remote, but there are people that care about this, and there are one or two who would probably make an issue out of it, and they know. Mm-hmm. And then what happens? This is, you know, I think it through. Okay, so then the government just come down and take your chickens away and kill them. Yeah. So you know, I've made the choice, which I feel diminished by. Plus, I had to spend all weekend building this thing when I should have been doing something else. It was a weekend before I came away to America. I was spending it with my children, you know. So, you know, things like that, that's what bugs me, because I want to stand up and say no. But in many situations, they're like small little cuts. Mm-hmm. They're not the big battles that you want to stand up and fight. They're the little cuts that you go, that's just a graze. I'm all right with that. But I'm not all right with it, in all honesty, because I know they build up. Yeah. Yes, they do.
That's tough. Is there, I mean, are there other, you know, bird owners, chicken owners who are like you?
There are, but
it's the principle. I mean, that's the problem. Is that small cut? You're right. Is just the small one, but it builds. I mean, that's a culture, right? It's a culture of having people who will spy, you know, tell on you and say he's breaking the law, or he's the one who's doing it, and it's that's the problem. Is we have a culture of people who don't appreciate or even want their own freedom.
But it's true as well. I mean, you said, are there other people around who think like me? There are a number of us, in fact. And I would say, even if there were 10 families who thought like us and 2 that didn't, the 2 that didn't could wreak havoc on the other 10, because they lean on the big bully. We're a unit, but the government's bigger than us. It's stronger than us. It's gonna.
It is, but it's in one sense. I mean, this is. I want to tread lightly here in terms of how I say this, but it is a personal belief that evil itself, and I'm not saying in every case the big state is evil, but is impotent. It only thrives off of the power that we give it, and so it's amazing how often throughout history, when you have one person, small group. In fact, that's usually how history changes in the first place. It's not like you get a whole... Democracy doesn't work in historical terms. It's not like big mobs of people change anything. It's one person saying, no, I'm not taking this. This is not right. And then having what we in this organization call the first follower. You know, one person who goes, he's not crazy. I'm jumping on his boat. I'm going to his city. And then before you know it, you have enough of a critical mass, not majority by any stretch, but that are saying no, and then the bureaucracy or the neighbor who's a spy, they start to get weak. They start to show their true colors.
I suppose part of me thinks that, is this the issue I want to martyr myself on? I suppose that would be it. The me of the young 20-year-old single guy me, I did a lot of things, very subversive things. The me with a full family at my responsibility is a different guy. Yeah. I am a different guy, it has to be said. Yeah. And I'm bringing my children up to be very thoughtful about freedom. And I almost feel sorry for them in a way, because it's a hard thing.
It is.
And I know I have to do it, but I'm not even necessarily they'll be in a few, because my eldest is only 12, but in the next few years, she'll probably end up being more freedom-minded than myself, because she'll have nothing to lose. Whereas maybe in my old age I'll have nothing to lose as well. Maybe that's a good time to really go full blown.
Well, and that's the other thing is, when you think about, and I don't want I spend my life trying to help people acquire security, financial security, build a nest egg. And so it's really important to me personally to do that for myself and for me to help clients do that. But I also feel like, there's a hierarchy of values that you have, and your dignity, your self-esteem. There's nothing more important than that. And it's a really good question to say, well, okay, what hill am I going to plant my flag on? Where am I willing to take that stand versus go shrug off the little cuts? We use, I don't know if you're familiar with Ayn Rand or
Sure.
The Atlas Shrugged that we use in our leadership program of the Rockies curriculum. But that's the whole point of the book. That's the whole point of the title. You have, the people who are virtuous, the people who really are good, productive. Do they need to put up with it? Or can they shrug? Can they say, no, okay, I'm willing to shrug. I'm willing, in the case of the book, am I willing to give up my, my family railroad? Am I willing to give that up? This is my identity. Or am I, I don't want to go into spoiling the book, but people who know the book, the novel, that is a part of the whole idea and it's so funny because people who don't know Ayn Rand and don't know her writing they talk about her as if, the dollar, the almighty dollar, or the wealth acquisition is the only thing she cares about. Whereas she's really demonstrating throughout all of her novels, and especially in Atlas Shrugged, of people who are willing to say, no, money or the wealth that I have or the material comfort that I have, that's not more important than my dignity and my self-esteem.
How does that work? I agree with you wholeheartedly there, but there are a number of new predicaments in my life now. Hence, I'm talking about my children here. And when I make decisions now, I'm making a decision on behalf of 3 children and a wife. And I find that different. I find that it's not me. Sure, I could put up with a lot of shit. I could lose my railroad. It wouldn't matter to me. But it would probably matter to my children because they would probably feel like I did it to them. Rather than...
But they also might feel differently, entirely differently. They might feel like my dad was a hero because he stood up for this. The railroad or my chickens were not that important. My dad stood up for my freedom, my ability to make my own choices in life.
I think they already feel, I'm pretty sure they don't necessarily understand that yet, but they will, because I have never been candid about my beliefs with my children. And as a result, they,
Why not?
Well, because, you hope, you don't want to convince them too much. I always tell them 2 sides of the story or whatever I can, but it's quite obvious what my side of the story is. And my theory, long-term theory is I'm without forcing anyone to do anything, which I'm not. By the time they get to that age where they leave, where they really are free, and they're on this journey of freedom from us, basically, their mum and dad, they will have been equipped with the tools already to realize. And I'm not sure where I get it from, because my mother and father weren't necessarily inclined that way. It just has so happened that Well,
you made choices, right?
Yes.
I mean, you observed things, maybe about your parents or about your schooling or about, you observed reality, the reality that were brought with, and made some choices. I mean, it's interesting. That's a whole different discussion, right? To talk about, how do people decide? I mean, do you believe in free will, or is it nature versus nurture, or those kinds of issues? But you, in my view, you likely made certain choices to say, okay, I'm choosing something different.
There's a lot of nature in it, for sure, because my children showed it from a young age.
You mean in terms of that independence?
Yes, and that sort of independent spirit, definitely.
Maybe it's some nurture as well. I mean, it sounds like
there obviously is some, but I mean, it was there. I think there are some people predisposed to that. If I was to cut to the chase, I would say that it's about personal responsibility. There are some people who embody the principles of wanting to take on personal responsibility. And then there are people who don't, and they are the people that don't mind being locked up. And if you are of someone who takes full responsibility for things, and it's definitely a naturally occurring thing in some people to sort of, if they see something, they feel some kind of responsibility for it, even if it's not them, it's just around them or something like that. And I think that's really what decides that. If you go back far enough in the psyche of human beings, you know.
Yeah, it's hard to know. I'm not, I find psychology fascinating. To me, it's like if I draw the pie chart and, there's nature, nurture, and free will. Free will is the smallest slice, but it's the largest in one sense. Obviously, it isn't in the moment, but you have, the point of power is in that current moment where you can make choices. That's my belief, and I think that people, even if you in your I mean, there are countless examples of people who seem to be in their nature more security conscious, not risk takers, not even wanted to think independently. And that's how they're raised as well, who for some reason or another, at some point, make a different choice and decide, no, I want to take the risk. It's funny, I took a ski camp just this last week with my daughter, and they use a phrase. I don't know if you're a skier or not, but when you're on these really high, steep slopes, there's always the tendency to want to, make sure you're close to the mountain. But they use this phrase, living on the edge is what gives you control. And I thought that was a good analogy for life in terms of the way I think about it. Just having, being willing to tip yourself onto the edge of your skis is what actually gives you more control and therefore less risk, even though it feels like more.
More able to adapt. Mm-hmm. And in fact, but I mean, even in when I think about my ability to adapt, it's very much connected with something I wouldn't call free will. In fact, there appears to be a path of the river that I'm floating down, if you know what I mean. And my life goes best when I just let the current take me, and that would be me adapting. Yeah. Hanging on to the side, which is kind of a bit of an antithesis to free will. It's alluding to the fact that sure, you have free will, but actually you've
gone with that flow.
Yeah,
but there's a contradiction there too, right? I mean, you're not wanting to go with the flow, and you're resistant in some ways of the way the whole thing is flowing. That's what it sounds like to me.
No, I'm not, though. That's what I'm saying. Whenever I notice that I am resisting, it's normally when things aren't going well.
Yeah.
And it's easy once you notice them.
Yeah.
And because then I have, over the years at least, learned to make peace quite quickly with something going wrong, because I feel ownership of my own life. Therefore, if something bad's happening, it's obviously to do with me. I'm not being persecuted, I'm not being, so I need to then understand that problem is there because of me. So what do I do to actually circumnavigate it or go and investigate it or whatever, Let's talk about the Leadership of the Rockies program, which I knew nothing about until this weekend. And this, just going back to what we were talking about earlier about when I asked you, how do you envisage all this stuff working out? If you're teaching, from the title, you're sort of teaching leadership, right? Mm-hmm. So where do you imagine these leaders will be leading?
Well, it's we're teaching self-leadership first, and the program grew out of a more formal political leadership type of environment. It was, in a sense, my view is it was sort of a farm team for developing conservative politicians in the state of Colorado. That's a long time ago. It's much more ideological today, not political. And so the leaders that we're talking about are leaders in every area of life. We have teachers, we do have aspiring politicians, but we have clergy people, we have corporate people, we have whatever kind of occupation you can think of and age differences that you can think of. We have those people represented in our organization, and they're having an impact. We call it building an army for freedom, and they're having an impact in their circle of impact, their circle of influence, wherever they might be, in terms of having a dialogue about freedom, about self-responsibility, about productivity, about freedom, about mutual voluntary trade. So the conversations that they have aren't necessarily political. Obviously, that can morph into a political discussion when you're talking about these things. But the leadership we're trying to grow is that culture of people who are free.
And would you, I mean, if you could choose, would the political system not exist at all, or do you think it's a necessary evil, or not even an evil?
I think it's a necessary good. I mean, when I refer, and this is where I might differ with most of my libertarian friends. I think government is important. I think government is a necessary good. It just has to be in its proper, very well-defined role. And again, I go back to, I think the founders were geniuses in this way of recognizing that. Not fully, not completely, but they did 99% of the heavy lifting in terms of identifying the purpose of government is to protect rights, and you have to have a clear understanding of what that means, what a right is. You don't have a right to health care, you don't have a right to a Learjet, you don't have a right to stuff, you have a right to act, you have a right to pursue happiness.
What was the 1% they missed then? You just said 99% correct.
I don't think they realized the onslaught of deeper philosophy. This is why I talked about they weren't philosophical enough to realize the challenges that would be posed to, and really the subversion, in a sense, of American politicians who were, like many politicians, wanting to acquire power, and who would use the language of the founding to actually subvert freedom in the first place. I mean, the whole progressive movement is basically that. They're using the idea of freedom and rights, using the language, these concepts of freedom and rights, and using them entirely improperly.
So they were naive to that.
I think they were a bit naive to that, to how. I mean, I'm not certain of that. I mean, they were well informed enough to know that you had to have a productive, moral populace of citizens to retain that kind of freedom. And they weren't. They warned people of that. This is, a republic if you can keep it, right?
So okay, the progressive side of this spectrum, where does it fit into the grand scheme of things, according to you?
Well, from a political standpoint, it is the source of evil. I mean, philosophically, it's mainly European, maybe even closer German philosophical roots that America imported, that bore fruit after the Civil War into the progressive movement in both parties. I mean, the original progressive was Teddy Roosevelt, a Republican, a Republican hero, and then you go on to Woodrow Wilson and then FDR and all the redefining the idea of rights to be. You have economic rights, you have rights to things, you have rights to other people's productivity, and that's where the whole ship went wrong.
I want to hear I want you to break down the definition for me then. Progressiveness, or progressivity? What's it called?
Progressivism.
Progressivism. What is it to you? Or what is it, not necessarily even to you, what is the definition of it?
I don't know if I have a formal definition of progressivism.
What is it for you then?
But it is that. It's that idea of not understanding human nature and believing that you can mold people and you can shape them into what you want for a more global or collective purpose. You can shape people into what you want to be a cog in a bigger picture versus recognizing their individuality. And that's where you preach these ideas of collectivism and collective rights or collective actions. And I'm not saying that you don't have groups. Obviously you have groups and teams and lots of ways people associate with each other. But the biggest difference is, the willingness to use the force of government, of coercion, the power of the state to shape people.
So the idea, the progressive idea, in certain scenarios is absolutely natural. Say in a team, the idea to associate everyone, to relinquish your individuality for the sake of the team, for example,
by choice. And I don't think that has anything to do with progressivism itself. I mean, I think that collective, that's a form of, we are social beings, and we like to be part of a team. We like to be part of a family, but we like to. I mean, obviously, you don't get to choose your family, but when you go to work for a corporation, you're doing that voluntarily. You're saying, okay, they're offering me a value. They're going to pay me to do certain things that I hopefully don't hate. I mean, I'm making a choice. I'm deciding, and whether I buy into the bigger picture or not, I'm deciding, it's fitting into my needs, versus you're being forced into it.
And so would you say that the whole movement, or the whole progressive movement, arose out of someone or some number of people's desire to control other people? Would that be it?
I think that's absolutely true. I think that philosophically, I think that's and psychologically, I think that's the root. People who are insecure. I think that is, when you look, and this is psychologizing, which I maybe don't have a whole lot of expertise in doing that, but when I think about that, of what motivates freedom lovers, whether they're in the libertarian camp or the conservative camp or center right, or someone who just says, wait, there's too much government and we shouldn't have that kind of control on us, versus someone I think of who's considers themselves a progressive. I think that's oftentimes someone who's characterized by fear and wanting to control that fear, and therefore wanting to control other people, and they maybe are doing that consciously or subconsciously.
Isn't it a bit of a? I mean, there's a paradox there, in as much as in the political sphere, progressivism in the hands of the state is obviously a bad thing. But how, as someone who believes in individual rights, would you assert that on a democratic so-called system, if you see what I mean? It seems like a bit of a paradox.
No, that is the challenge. Absolutely. I'm saying that we should have a government. We should have a system like that. And I'm claiming that it needs to be in its proper role. Now, what I mean by that is I think you can prove that. I think you can actually prove that objectively, that is, in a real sense, I think the founders made that discovery. People don't think of the founders necessarily as innovators and discovering something, but I think they did. I think they discovered something about human nature and what it takes to actually have people thrive, not only individually, but ironically in groups as well.
I heard relatively recently, another of my mind-blown moments in later life. So I heard someone call the Constitution a technology, which I thought was a really fascinating and interesting way to describe it, which you're just alluding to there, that this discovery of a set of ideas which were then imbued into something, which then became a sort of abstract force in America, which I think is absolutely amazing. And it's the thing I love most about America, is that when I'm back home, that abstract force doesn't exist. Yeah. When someone, you often see people on YouTube or on video, whatever, asserting their right, literally declaring a right that they have, which we have. And that really is a powerful thing to be able to do. And I know that theoretically one should be able to find that from within themselves. They shouldn't necessarily rely on an abstract version of that power.
Well, we all need models, right? We all need inspiration. I mean, who out there really is truly an innovator? I mean, the founders were relying on a Brit, right? John Locke. I mean, they were taking those ideas and tweaking them some, but they didn't come up necessarily with that entirely on their own. So I'm curious, when you say you don't see that in the UK.
Well, we don't have a constitution.
That's true. That's true.
But I think I'm not sure people understand.
When you talk about culturally, well, you don't have a slave mentality there.
We have a very polite mentality, for sure. We don't like annoying other people. I think a lot of Americans underestimate the power, like I say, the abstract power of the Constitution. Yeah.
It's more important to
the Bill of Rights.
Well, the Declaration.
Yeah.
I mean, I think this is a crucial thing. People dismiss the Declaration as, well, okay, that's what you took to say F you to the King and the Brits. But it was more than that. It was much more. I mean, the statement, the clarity of the statement that every person has a right to their life, to pursue their own life. That's the key thing. That's the whole thing that animates what you're talking about. The abstraction that you're talking about, that the Constitution is sort of the rule book to say, okay, here's how we now play this game. This is how we're going to govern. But the more important document is the Declaration and that statement about rights, about, you as an individual have that. No one can take that away. They can take it away politically. They can take out their gun and threaten you, and they can whip you, and they can put you in a cage like your chickens. But that doesn't mean they're right. They are still violating you.
Well, all right then. I can still understand that in the UK. But when it comes time to stand up to the enforcer, in America, you have a very powerful abstract force at your will. And I'm not sure a lot of Americans appreciate that. And free speech is a perfect example because it's a very simple thing, free speech. Myself and home, I believe in free speech, of course. I actually believe, I'm an absolutist with free speech. I really don't care what anyone says. But we have laws in the UK now which are getting quite unbelievable, really. And there is no one to back you up. There are people that can say, no, that is illegal. Saying that thing is illegal. And I would love to stand up to that. But I know that actually the abstract power that's working on me, which is the legal system, is actually has got more manpower, more care to sort of like make sure that I fit in than I have to sort of, not fit in.
So this is. It sounds like you need to move you and your kids and your chickens to Colorado.
For sure. Well, look. Well, then, but okay. I
mean, that's a real thing to say. Okay, well, you still have the freedom of movement, although that is changing. That's a whole another thing. Immigration and the right to be able to move is something that is, I think, under threat even here.
Do you know what though about America? I love most things about America, but what I don't understand is your taxation policy on. So as an American citizen, you can't go and work in another country without continuing to pay the man back here. And I find that completely antithetical to all the other things that seem really cool about America.
I agree.
So how does that even happen? How does that exist? And because there aren't that many countries that actually do that. I know there's a lot of countries that probably want to do it.
Right.
But of all the countries I would have thought that wouldn't, would be the US.
Yeah. Well, I think that's just indicative of the erosion of our culture. Just to have that be in place now for decades, where we're saying we have that kind of control over you. You somehow owe us. You were born here, or you work here. You moved here and you're working somewhere else. We control you in that sense. We're taking our cut.
It's quite a big cut.
It's a bad thing. It is a big cut.
Yeah, but what I mean is I don't understand how it evolved alongside the Constitution. It does seem like it would be, someone would have called it out a long time ago in a much more substantial way, because it didn't evolve in the UK. It didn't evolve in a number of countries, which are far less liberty-minded, right. I would say. And I think of all the things, I mean, all right, you can appreciate the desire to be in America is quite strong for a lot of people. Hence, the government can do things like that because you don't really, you want to be there more than you want to not pay them tax when you leave, right. or have to pay an exorbitant exit tax, right. or whatever.
Yeah, in a sense, I mean, I don't like this analogy at all, but in a sense, it is a supply and demand thing, right? I mean, if you think of the state having that kind of role in people's lives in the first place, well, you're going to pay the piper.
And it's a shame.
It is a shame.
Do you think there's any talk? I think I even heard that in Trump's first term, he actually sort of enshrined that even more deeply into
I believe
law.
That. Yeah. I don't know that for a fact, but I believe that seems perfectly fitting with my judgment of his personality and his whole persona. I mean, he says he wants to make America great again, and people believe he thinks America is a great thing, but he has no understanding, in my view, of what that culture you're talking about, and certainly he gives no evidence that he's even read the Constitution or the Declaration.
So who are your heroes then, in modern day heroes?
You mean politically?
No, people who imbue these attributes and really live it and really are as inspirational. They're famous or not famous, doesn't have to be.
There's a great many people who I would call heroic, that in that way. I mean, we had a speaker a number of years ago here. He was at the top of his game in banking, John Allison, for BB&T Bank, which is a small regional bank when he took it over, and it turned into a much larger organization. And during the financial crisis, he was defiant with the whole Treasury Department trying to force TARP, all the things that went on during the Great Financial Crisis. He was very principled. He's a hero. I have a friend who comes and speaks to our leadership program. His name is Yaron Brook. He was in charge of the Ayn Rand Institute. He still is. He's still the chairman of the Ayn Rand Institute. He in my view, there's no greater champion of the system of capitalism than Yaron Brook. He's got a podcast and a show. I would say he's fantastic. There's a lot of business people who forget about politics and just produce. They find a way. Sometimes they make compromises in the system that they exist in. Especially now in technology, there's a lot of really great innovators in that field who, they had a lot of freedom to produce and to innovate, and now that the government's trying to step on them. I mean, this is partly the whole issue with Bitcoin and people in that space, right? They're like, let's find a way around this.
Well, yeah. I mean, my view on what you were just talking about is, I'm not sure we need the political process myself.
Yeah.
There are a number of examples of places I've been around the world where politics doesn't really exist. Monarchies that run well, and people live there because they're getting treated well, and if they didn't, then they'd leave. Like somewhere like Dubai is a very good example of this. People choose to go there. There's no voting in Dubai. You don't go to Dubai to vote on how the government runs things. Because
isn't that sort of artificial in terms of how? And I don't know enough about Dubai, but my impression is that the people who are citizens there and born there don't have the same kind of freedom that you or I might, because they're trying to attract capital. I mean, I was just mentioning Yaron Brook. He moved to Puerto Rico because it's an American protectorate, but there's a special deal for taxes. He pays 4% taxes.
Sure.
So he moved there to take advantage of that. And there's all kinds of deals that are cut to attract capital that way. And I don't necessarily think that's a bad thing. I mean, the worst thing in the world is the whole tax harmonization movement. That's a globalist, horrible movement to try to say, all governments are going to make their own, or agree to this. Monopolistic power.
I'm not saying that that attracting capital is a bad thing. I mean, the political process isn't necessarily necessary. Let's say.
But is that because it's more accepted? Okay, that's just part of the deal. And if I'm born there and a citizen there, I have no power in the first place, and I'm only benefiting because of the policies to attract new capital.
Correct. But in the 21st century, we have many more options now to vote with our feet. Yeah. And I mean, my actual personal belief is of a future of many smaller free cities or small jurisdictions, which all compete for you. Mm-hmm. And there would be no political process. Mm-hmm. There would be no need for it.
I don't know. I don't understand that. And then maybe you can just educate me more about that. Well, again, I've been exposed to it, but I don't know.
I'll give an example. One of the best examples would be cruise liners. Mm-hmm. Cruise liners are basically floating private cities. Yeah. They have a flag, which is often a random country, Seychelles or something. When you step onto a ship, you don't wonder about voting on the captain. And the captain looks rather. He's often dressed up in a. He's got medals and a tweed cap. But you don't wonder whether you need to vote. You just look around the ship and you say, "Is this a good ship?
Right.
Is the
He's
service
in charge,
good?
but
am I getting a good service?" And if you are, you stay there. This would be the kind of idea behind a free city, a private city, is you choose to opt into it because you want to be there. And when you're not, and I mean, cruise liners have their own bona fide laws. They have the regulations that they abide by, which aren't necessarily the laws of the country that they're at. So I think this gives you a general sense of how a non-political world could work. But it requires, I think, from my perspective anyway, it requires small jurisdictions. When you get these big behemoths states, Russia, America, Europe, then it becomes quite difficult because, obviously, by the time you have them that big, I think you've already gone too far anyway.
Is it the bigness? I mean,
I think so. I think so personally, because I think that you can't, like when you're, I mean, even in your own life, you can see if you're within your family, it's very easy to keep everyone happy in your family, isn't it?
Well, not so much.
Well,
that's the point,
what I mean,
though, right? That is the point.
Yeah.
It's not, maybe not so easy in your individual family. Good God, how do you do it?
Exactly. Well, as you scale it, and this is, I would say that the collectivist idea has a similar paradox. Yeah. On a small scale, it's quite easy to implement, and actually, I think that's where it should reside. But once it gets bigger and bigger and bigger, it becomes impossible to please everyone. So your only alternative is then to enforce, and then you get a problem.
But that is what happens on a ship too, right? If there's conflict, the guy with the medals and the hat, who's maybe looks like a fancy butler, now is the one in charge who will put the force into play to say, here's how we do things here. You came onto the ship and you're going to abide by our rules. And guess what? The conflict is going to be solved this way.
Absolutely right. And they often have a jail on a ship. Yeah. Or they have the right to kick you off on an island, wherever you are. True, yes. But I've never seen a ship with 1 million people on it, or 50 million people, or 300 million people. Right. And I think it's very difficult. I mean, a good example is, when we look at Europe now, people, crazy people I would call them, think of Europe as a place, and it's ridiculous. When we were in the European Union, the UK has nothing in common with Romania, for example. And I love Romania, and I love Romanian people, and I've been there, and I love that place. But should we abide by the same rules? Probably not. But I'm closer to Romania than you are to probably California or somewhere like that. To be honest, but you've been a group of people for longer. Mm-hmm. But I don't think that there's a lot of similarities between Californians and Texans, for example.
There are a lot. I mean, there's a lot made of the differences, but there really is a lot, I think. Really? And I would also say, I've been to Romania, and I'd say there's a lot that's common between me and a Romanian. But that's the challenge, is when there's conflict. How does that conflict get resolved? And that's, to me, the role for a government of some kind.
All right. I would say then, in the case of Romania, why should someone in the middle of Germany or Belgium decide what happens in a small Romanian village?
They should.
Exactly, right. So that is a problem with scaling your government. Yeah. If there is someone in charge, I want to be able to talk to them, and I want them to understand the nature of the problems that are happening. Yeah. And as a result, it has to be small scale, because you can't have it any other way.
I'm not certain that's true. I'm willing to be educated in that regard, but I think it's less about size, although I think size is important. In fact, I've heard compelling arguments to say, the U.S. really should be broken up into, 3 or 4 at a minimum, regional governing type bodies, but I don't think it's necessarily about size. I think it's getting clear on what the role of government is in the first place, and that's what no one has a clue about, even Americans. I mean, again, I think the founders did the great job of sort of defining that, but we've forgotten that, and it's been threatened for so long that it's It's just not understood clearly.
Answer me this then. Why shouldn't the US break up into individual parts?
I'm not sure that it shouldn't.
Well, what would be the downside for you then?
For me personally, I don't think there would be a downside. I do think it would be dependent upon why it's breaking up. I think. I mean, this is a good question. I don't know how well you know the Civil War, but should the South have been able to say, as they did, look, we have states' rights and we get to do what we want. We have this particular institution that we're going to continue to do. And Lincoln and the North said, no, you're not going to. That's a violation of rights. That's a violation of the Constitution. Now, it's mixed, whether Lincoln was really that clearly saving the Union for saving the Union's sake or saving the Union's on principle of the individual rights of the African Americans in the South. But that was the point. And so if you say, these 3 or 4 regional areas say we want to abdicate or get out of the Union, for what reason? To violate someone's rights worse than the U.S. government is? Well, that's not good. But I absolutely buy in the idea. I've heard about the free state movement. I've heard about free cities, and to me, that's all good. You still do need a governing body that says, okay, here's how we enforce contracts. Here's how we actually protect people's rights.
No, I think I agree with you.
Can I do a little check-in?
What's that?
Can I do a little check-in? I don't know what time. How long are we going to go?
Oh, it doesn't really matter. We've been going 1 hour, 13 minutes. Sorry, have you got somewhere to go?
I do.
Oh, sorry, what time?
I should probably wrap up in about 10 or 15.
Oh, okay. No problem.
Unless you have a lot that you want to
No, I can talk for hours.
How much do you edit it down?
Nothing. No,
this is fantastic. I wish I hadn't scheduled this thing
I've done
you earlier.
4.5 hour ones before. I'm interested.
And you actually don't cut that down?
No. The only thing I cut out is, for example, when I checked the sound earlier, I'll cut that out.
Like this.
But to be honest, I might even leave this in actually because it's interesting. But it's really annoying. It's really hard to cut when you're doing video as well. Anyway, so I don't even really want to. But no, I'm interested. I want to know what you've got to say. So we could do it another time maybe, but I'll try and wrap it up. What were we talking about then? I didn't get. I wasn't satisfied with my.
Well, you're not maybe satisfied because I don't know if I have.
Oh no, size
clarity. Yeah, I mean the thing is that it's fascinating to me to think about the concept of you're talking about, especially when you're talking about mobile, floating ships or floating cities or whatever. But to me, there's not enough to say that you don't need a monopoly of force.
Yeah. I don't think, in the famous model of governance that inspired the Free Cities movement is the free private city model. Mm-hmm. And there you have a city operator, mm-hmm. but it's a business mm-hmm. and it's not political. Mm-hmm. You sign a contract when you join the city, which would, it seems, this all seems totally obvious and normal to me. But I think signing a contract to join America might be more difficult because it's a very large place and it's got a lot of different things going on. And I don't know. My gut instinct is that the reason that a lot of strife and trouble that's happening in the world happens because centralizing power gets too bit over a too larger area.
And just disconnected from the actual people.
And then it becomes abstract.
It's
and
funny.
Then people
I've played with this idea because most people I know, you can imagine this. Most people I know would say, the UN and world governance is just pure evil, which on the surface I agree with.
I think I do. Not say evil. I just think misguided. I
would almost say evil today, but I play with the idea of saying, well, if that body really understood the purpose of government, is it possible to have a world government that says, okay, what we're doing, our only job is to protect rights. That's our job.
Maybe, but here's the problem. I think it's hard to be accountable when you are a government for the whole world. If you're my local government and I know where you live and I've got a problem with the way you're governing, I can knock on your door. You can't knock on the door of the United Nations. And they know that. And it's a supply and demand thing again. It's like they can do whatever the hell they want,
right?
Because they know that there are so many layers of people and bureaucrats and nonsense between you and them. Yeah. So I do think there is a problem. I mean, it's solidifying the idea.
The accountability and the abstractness of it all would seem like it's impossible. Yeah, I think that makes sense.
One of the best, the best arguments in favor of large states for me was the one of war. No, it wasn't even in favor. It was the other way around. A lot of people say having large blocks of countries keeps war to a minimum.
Yeah.
But actually, you have less wars. But when you do have a war, it's absolutely catastrophic. And actually, you'd be better off having lots of little concurrent wars going on all the time between small states. But no, I thinking about it now, I think it's a question of scale. I mean, any time we become disconnected from our fellow man,
well, and that
we
make
decisions.
That's sort of partly why people have that appeal to democracy, right? Well, I get a vote. There's some accountability, right? I mean, it's not like pounding on the door, but that's the appeal, right? I think.
Yeah, I think, but it's a very personal and stupid personal opinion that you would have some kind of power when you tick a box and put it in a ballot box. I mean, it seems ridiculous. It's purely...
Well, they do respond to that.
Yeah, people, you mean?
Yeah,
of course. But the truth doesn't respond to it. Yeah. Do you know what I mean? It's like
that's why you're talking about a whole different level. Politics is not as important as culture. You know, you have to have a culture of freedom-loving people to actually have that continue and to have them understand that, and that means you have to have people who are interested in sharing that with other people, sharing that that they will be better off if they're more free. It's like having a great coach who says, do the work. I can show you how to hit a tennis ball or ski on the mountain, but you're going to be a lot better off when you learn how to put your skis on edge and do it this way, when you own it, when you actually do that work.
I feel like that was a nice way to round it off, actually. I don't want to stop talking now, obviously.
I don't either, actually. I apologize. This has been fantastic. It's been one of the best conversations I've had in a while.
Good. That's what we do at the Free Cities podcast. But that was a nice way to end because it was a positive, and I like that. And I know that I've taken you a little bit aback, and you've got somewhere to go. But... thanks for coming in.
I would love to do it more. I mean, I don't feel like either I asked good enough questions or you got a chance to share more about the whole idea.
Well, I think Americans and people, especially liberty-minded Americans, are in a very unique position. You have a lot of experience. Do you know what I mean? Intrinsic experience. Yeah. And I'm absolutely avid to learn of that because I know the difference between here and where I come from. And it's black and white. Yeah. It really is. And I realized this in an extreme way during the pandemic when I looked to my sides and I saw really no one standing alongside with me. Yeah. Really, one or two. And then we all looked at each other and went, look, what are we going to do? Let's just make it through this. And whereas I feel that in a place like many places around America, there was solidarity amongst people who actually realized this is important. Yeah. And I want that. And I want to know how to foster and grow that in my own country. And I'm not sure it would even happen in my lifetime, if I'm honest. But I want it for my family, and I want it for the people that I know, and I want to inspire them. So, let's have another conversation and another time, and we'll dive a lot deeper. But yeah, I've got 1,000,001 questions. Don't worry.
Yeah, you're good. So, how do you? What's success? Is it just listeners? Getting more people who listen, or more sponsors, or how do you measure? I mean, you have a passion for. And I don't know if it's purely the free cities.
No, it's freedom.
Yeah,
it's freedom. How do I
How do you measure whether? I mean, obviously,
It's
you go
purely personal.
Yeah.
I'm here to measure myself, and people listen, and I think that's all you can do. In all honesty, you can lead by example, can't you? Presumably, you teach this at a leadership program, and the only way to lead by example is to do it. And you have to do the work yourself, the personal work, to understand yourself, to, all these kind of things. So, yeah, I mean, really and honestly, I've always done that in my life. I've pursued a number of things to an extreme to understand them myself. And fortunately, we live in a time now where you can share that journey, and this is a great example. I hope a number of people will listen to me trying to grapple with this myself and appreciate their own struggle, and because it's happened to me on other podcasts. I've had my life changed mowing the lawn with a set of headphones on, literally, and I had a moment where I had to stop and go, "Oh my God, my life will never be the same again as I'm sort of mowing lines in the lawn, And this is an amazing age to live in, and I think we talk about this a lot on this podcast. This is a moment in history because we have the internet now, which is the printing press of its time. And we all know what happened when the printing press was invented. There was a very chaotic couple of centuries.
Pretty hard to put that genie back in the bottle.
Exactly. And I don't intend to put it back in the bottle. I intend to shake the bottle and up and
I love
let it out.
I'm really glad you're here. I hope I get a chance to talk to you more, especially like are you here all weekend?
Yes, I'm leaving on Monday. Yes, I'm staying on Sunday as well. I'm doing some more. I'm doing interviews. I'm doing as many interviews as I can, basically, because there's a lot of interesting people here.
That's great.
And anything I can get, I will. And actually, I'm going to New Hampshire after this.
Okay.
I'm doing a week over there to meet all the free state people as well. Yeah. While I'm in America, so
that's great.
But yeah, Mike, it's been great meeting you. And
likewise, thank
sorry
you so
we're
much.
cutting it short. And good luck with whatever it is you're going to next. And good luck with the whole. We didn't even talk about half the things you do, but anyway,
I want to do it again.